The Triple Alliance was a defensive military alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It was formed on the 20th of May in 1882 and renewed periodically until its expiration in 1915 during World War I. However, the Italian public was never overly happy with their alliance with Austria-Hungary, as the two countries had been enemies in the Italian War of Independence and the Wars of Italian Unification, despite the fact that the Italian government was very happy with this alliance. Now, the years before World War I saw many distinguished military analysts predict that Italy would attack Austria-Hungary in the event of a large-scale European conflict. On the other side of things, the Austro-Hungarian General Staff maintained plans from as late as 1903 for a possible war against Rome. Mutual suspicions led to a reinforcement and escalation of the border, as well as speculation in the press about a war between the two countries in the 1900s and early 1910s. Now, as late as 1911, Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf was advocating for a preemptive strike against their supposed Italian ally. That prediction was also strengthened when Italy invaded and annexed Libya, as Hotzendorf saw an opportunity with Italian forces fighting against the Ottomans in Libya and the fact that the Ottoman Empire was backed by Germany. Despite all of these issues, however, Italy remained in the Triple Alliance and did not join with the Central Powers in World War I when war broke out, as the Triple Alliance was a defensive pact and not offensive. Italy's entry into World War I saw bidding by both sides, starting in August of 1914, where Russia was very eager for Italy's entry into the war to open a new front to paralyze the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But Russia really had nothing to offer Italy, so nothing came out of it. At first, Italy had expected the Central Powers to win the war, but as the war continued on and became even more drawn out, Italy was not necessarily in a hurry to join in. Austria-Hungary was offering too little territorial concessions to Italy and was showing its military weaknesses constantly. Berlin also pressured Vienna to make even more territorial concessions to Rome, but this never happened. But all of this was too little too late for Italy, as it turned more and more towards the Entente, who was more than willing to promise large territorial spoils from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman Empire's corpses. Italy's very long coastline also made it exposed to the vastly superior Entente navies, and public opinion was divided by February of 1915 as Italy began negotiating with both sides, but had pretty much decided that the Allies were the ones making the better offers. Everyone kind of just ignored the poor state of the Italian military and expected that Britain and France would do all the fighting where it was necessary. The Italian treasury also could not fund the war, but agreed that there were promises for money and munitions from London and Paris, so everything would be all fine and dandy. Therefore, Italy decided to join the Entente. What has changed in this alternate timeline will be to have Italy remain in the Triple Alliance and be part of the Central Powers against the Entente in World War I. Will have to have conditions such as Germany pressuring Austria-Hungary earlier to give more territorial concessions to Italy in exchange for a declaration of war against France, and this would have to come in late 1914 after German victories on the Eastern Front, or it's more likely that these negotiations would have to continue until the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive, which resulted in the Russian Great Retreat, and therefore Italy will be joining World War I as a central power in May of 1915. It would also help if Austria-Hungary and Italy did not have a lot of pre-war disputes, but come on, this is history, and that's a concession that cannot be changed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire will not have to deal with the Italian front now in this alternate World War I, and it does free up divisions to be sent to the Eastern Front now. But the thing is that the Italian front in our timeline was one of the only places in World War I where Austria-Hungary really shined. So Austria-Hungary will definitely be seen as a terrible ally by Germany and the other Central Powers. Other consequences for Austria-Hungary will be that since they conceded territory to Italy in exchange for joining the war, other ethnic groups within the empire could be pushing even more for independence guarantees or some levels of sovereignty in exchange for even fighting in the war now. But things avoided for the Central Powers would be the obvious loss of life in general on the Italian front due to the brutality of the mountain warfare of the Alps between Italy and the Austro-Hungarians. Italy's navy can now help the Austro-Hungarians in the Mediterranean against the British and French. However, there's going to need to be a lot more naval coordination, as I said before, that Italy was quite exposed. Additionally, the Western Front can now be expanded with the Italian entry into the war. In this alternate timeline, Italy opens up another front against France and launches an attack in 1915. The French and Entente are even further stretched across the Western Front now, and French morale further sinks. But like the rest of the Western Front, this front becomes a new stalemate. But But unlike the Western Front, however, the Italians are getting themselves into mountain warfare against the French, and the initial Italian offensive would see the Italian army needing to cross the Alps, something that wouldn't probably happen very well. The Italians versus the French on the Alps would most likely see similar results to our Italian front of World War I that we saw in our timeline. However, things will definitely depend on how well the initial Italian offensive into France goes. Since the French were very occupied on the Western Front, it's going to be a couple of weeks before the French army can muster a significant force to stop the Italians. However, France's greatest advantage and ally on this alternate Italian front is the Alps, which will definitely slow the Italians. With all of that, I'll say the Franco-Italian front is a mountain stalemate, but it further overstretches the Entente and saves the Austro-Hungarian and German forces for other fronts. Additionally, Italian artillery was very good during World War I and would definitely cause a massive headache for the French. Turning to the Balkans, there's likely more Central Powers forces going into Serbia for their second invasion. This might make the conquest of Serbia even faster, but overall, I'd say that very little has changed in the Balkans at this point in time. However, the Macedonia front from 1917 to 1918 will be changed as, again, more Central Powers troops can be sent down to the Entente into Greece. Regarding the Eastern Front, there's probably an earlier Russian capitulation and Russian Revolution, with a larger Central Powers force being able to lessen the blow of the 1916 Brusilov offensive. And for those who don't know, the Brusilov offensive was pretty much the Russian Empire's highest point in World War I, but it completely exhausted everything that Russia have. And if that's not going well for Russia, then things within Russia are definitely going very poorly at this point. Therefore, Austria-Hungary is not in near as much of a desperate situation than they were in our timeline after the Brusilov offensive, but the results are still pretty bad for the Empire. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire still has to deal with the Arab Revolt, but they are able to retain a lot of land except for southern Mesopotamia and Palestine during and after the war. This is because the Entente was able to push the Ottomans back successfully in the Middle East. Now, just because Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Bulgaria are doing better in this alternate timeline because of Italy's entry into the war, that doesn't necessarily mean that every member of the Central Powers is suddenly going to be doing great. Now, you see, the Ottomans had a ton of problems on their own, and Italian entry into the war doesn't really affect them in the Middle East, but does more so in Africa. Turning to what has changed in Africa, first off, we see that the Italians are in control of Libya, and Britain also has a little portion of Libya and, of course, Egypt. And then there's the Senussi rebels as another factor. The Senussi in our timeline were supported by the Ottomans and the Germans against the British and Italians, as Italy had taken Libya as a result of the Italo-Turkish War. Now, I don't think that the Senussi would be cool with fighting with Italy against the British, but I also don't think that they would necessarily want to hinder the Ottoman Empire. So they'd probably fight everyone. The British are going to have to fight in Libya and eventually take it with alliances with anti-Italian rebels, and are further diverted from other fronts as Italy has significant forces in North Africa in this time. But as I've said before, Italy is pretty exposed on the Mediterranean, so I don't think that Italy would be sending lots of troops to reinforce Libya. Now, how do all of these factors change the result of World War I? Well, I would say it strongly shifts the results to be more in a Central Powers' favor and possible victory in 1917, as French mutinies do still exist and are further expanded as a result of increasingly overstretching the front line. The Entente also has to send lots of forces into Libya, not just to pacify the Senussi, but the Italians as well, where I'm not fully sure how much the Italians would send into Libya, how well they would be performing, as well as who is commanding them, as well as vice versa for the Entente side. Now, one major factor to the war that I haven't discussed yet is American entry into World War I. In our timeline, the U.S. pretty much funded the Entente and entered due to unrestricted German submarine attacks after the Zimmermann telegram. In this alternate timeline, I don't think that Italian entry into the war for the Central Powers will discourage American cash being sent to the Entente. But overall, I don't think that Germany would still send the Zimmermann telegram or need to continue unrestricted submarine warfare, so the U.S. stays militarily neutral. That's not to say that Germany might not continue unrestricted submarine warfare, which pushes the U.S. into the war, but this is just my assessment for this alternate timeline. We may never know for sure. After this alternate World War I, Italy gains part of Egypt and France loses all of their colonies to Italy and Germany. Austria-Hungary is barely alive, as the Empire didn't suffer as much on the Eastern Front as they had in our timeline and had no Italian front. but they were only able to survive by making a deal with Italy, and other minority groups in the empire likely fight wars of independence. Bulgaria gets part of Serbia, and the Ottoman Empire still falls apart as it's reformed into a greater Turkish state. Meanwhile, Germany gains a lot of territory in Europe, so on that, just think of any stereotypical Germany wins World War I alternate history for their gains in Europe. Post-war Russia is fighting a different Russian civil war, but one that is much earlier. Russia is forced to fight against everybody that they see fit. Germany backs their own client states in the east, and all kinds of outside factors just fund their own warlords as the civil war breaks out a year earlier than it did in our timeline. Results of this chaotic Russian civil war is completely unknown, as the Russian Civil War is just mass chaos and the embodiment of just unknown factors. So who wins the Russian Civil War and the results for Russia, as well as the future of communism, are all beyond me in this alternate timeline. One thing is for sure, though, in this alternate timeline there is no rise of fascism in Italy. Not to say that there would not be other extreme ideologies rising in the post-war world and other European states, but fascism isn't coming to town in Italy, as the Italian war gains have pretty much been met and have all been occurring under the monarchy, but still at a heavy cost of life. But you know what? No Mussolini here, so suck it, fascism. But that is of course just one possible scenario for if Italy joined the Central Powers in World War I. What do you think would have happened? Write in the comments below, and thank you for watching.